Again. Hello and welcome to Mark Reid's Reading Rumble, and we've been sitting here talking for ages, not realizing it did not go live. So this is round 2. So welcome, glad you could join me. I'm going to skip past the formalities to get right into it because that's really depressing. I'm so sorry, Peter. I do apologize. Entirely my fault. We are definitely live now, so I really do apologize. We just had a conversation about the Jewish people for 15 minutes or so without realizing. Oh, that's terrible. Okay, so officially I'm the worst, and yeah, so do you want to maybe let's just recap what we've sort of said quickly. We're really talking about the differences and the similarities between the Jewish people and Jewish culture, Jewish religion, and the Christian religion that came after it that was based on it. We'd sort of covered the Jews' idea of end times, the Christians' idea of end times, and we'd sort of said that, hey, the Christians seem to see Jews an integral part of their religion, but the Jewish people don't see it the same way. Could you elaborate on that just quickly to overview that? Because I think that was an important point.
Are you hearing a feedback or echo?
I'm not. What does it sound like?
I'm hearing it's a few second delay.
Few second delay. Not 100%. Have you got the window open maybe with the broadcast on it?
Yeah.
Just check that it's muted or it's closed, and it could be coming through your side.
Is that it?
Testing. That fix it?
Seems better. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, so oh no, there it is again.
Well, don't close this tab. Maybe just close all the other ones, I suppose. That might do the trick. What else could it be? It definitely isn't showing up my side. I don't think it's my side. If someone in the chat could tell me if they're getting an echo when I'm speaking as well.
Oh,
definitely get a...
yeah, it is me. I see it. Okay, I understand now. Yeah.
Got it?
Yeah. I can hear you, but I don't see what happened to the window. Oh, here it is.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay, yeah, sorry. That's it. It was me. Sorry.
Okay, Robin says good. Thank you, Robin. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, so as far as the whole question of the role that Jews traditionally play in Christian theology, it tends to be in one direction. There's a term which I learned in school. I don't know, actually, I assume the Christians use it, although I'm actually not sure, but Supersessionism. The idea that the church superseded the Jews as God's people, and as
that
you just asked.
Does that relate to the new covenant kind of thing when they say, hey, there's a new covenant kind of stuff?
Yeah. And I guess because the new covenant is meant to include everyone, right? Which is why you don't have the specific obligations and practices that Jews do. But I mean, it is very different in the sense that, as I was saying before, when no one heard us, that
my fault. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. That Jewish thought has always tended to be much more focused on the Jewish people, and that salvation in that sense, isn't really a question of anything. Well, that's going a bit too far, but for many people, let's just say, salvation isn't a question of some broad change in the nature of reality or end of the world or anything like that. There is a bit of that in the Hebrew Bible, like in the prophet Zechariah. But there's also quite a bit more, I would say, about just the idea that the people, as I said, after the Babylonian exile, would be restored and be independent. And that was true for a while, but once that stopped being true, then the same questions were asked again. I would say that since ancient times, there's been maybe two big occasions on which this sort of thinking has resurfaced even within the Jewish world. One of them is after the Spanish expulsion in 1492, which affected a large proportion of the European Jewish community and sort of rejiggered the map quite a bit in the years afterward. So there were people around that time and afterward that thought that really was going to be the end of history. And then, of course, with the modern era, with the foundation of the State of Israel, and of course with the Holocaust, Jews, to a degree, but I would say more so Christians, have tended to read a lot into those events. And I know that you'll often hear Christians talk about how, well, the State of Israel was prophesied, right? And there it is. So, of course, that means,
Well, I have problems with that because they sort of say, hey, it was made a nation in one day, and that's simply not true. Well, I mean, if they were recognized a nation, every nation is recognized in one day. They just say, hey, we recognize this as a nation. And it was actually different nations and different people recognized the State of Israel over a long period of time. So I'm not sure how that sort of, I believe that's a bit of cherry picking there from sort of the Christians who say that. Do the Jews think the same thing, or does that prophecy exist in the Tanakh? Does it actually exist?
Well, it exists in the sense that I was just saying, where the prophecies were that they would return from Babylon and rebuild their nation. But I mean, no nation in antiquity had the kind of formal symbolism that we use today to decide more or less whether something is a country or not, right? Flags,
right.
Anthems,
official statehood, yeah,
social
sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Although what you said a moment ago about Christians saying it happened in one day, I don't know this for a fact, but the truth is that I think you could say that some Jews will actually point specifically to the fact that the UN recognized the state in 1947. So maybe that's what they have in mind. In fact, there's actually a street in Jerusalem which is called 29th of November, because that was the day that this happened.
But they've done that for all states. There's a
sure. No, yeah, absolutely.
The Republic of Tonga is now a state kind of thing. They will do that for almost everything. Although I think Papua New Guinea was one that they declared. So it's not exactly unusual for that to happen at all.
Right.
And I think there are a number of countries that still deny that Israel is a state. So it's kind of, it's a bit weird. So we get a lot of this sort of ending towards and revelations, and the Euphrates is going to dry up, and all of these events are going to happen. How much of that is in the Jewish tradition? How much of the you said it does delve into the end times a little bit. How much are we talking about? Does it give any clear indications on sort of the end of the world that we keep hearing about ad nauseum?
Well, like I said, there's a few things, like this whole concept, which again I think is in Zechariah, of this war between Gog and Magog.
Yes. Yep.
And there's meant to be an earthquake, I think. What else? Mostly, though, this sort of, if you like, supernatural aspects are not that widespread in the Bible. And later Jewish authorities, some of them actually explicitly say that we're only talking about, and of course, this whole concept of, the lion lying down with the lamb, right, and all of that, that's also there, of course. The end of war. But you have later Jewish writers like Maimonides, who's by far the most important and influential Jewish philosopher ever, saying that he doesn't see that the world is going to undergo some supernatural change or anything like that. There is a notion, of course, of the afterlife, and how that connects with these events, I think, is not as clear. It is considered a very important traditional Jewish belief, actually, but in the resurrection of the dead, actually, but I don't think generally people associate any specific series of events with that. And in fact, many Jewish authorities throughout history have said you actually should not try to calculate, even if you think you can, when this end is supposed to occur. And of course, among evangelicals, right, there's a whole, I don't know if you ever heard of that, was it his name William Miller, an American?
Oh, yeah. I know the guy that you're talking about. I'm not sure it was William Miller, but he kept calculating the end of the earth, like, every Tuesday kind of thing until he died, kind of stuff. He was absolutely terrible at it.
Another Howard Camping, I think his name was.
Yeah,
I think
Camping
apologized in the end.
Yeah, and then just went on to do it again, which is hilarious. But even though they sort of say, "Hey, we're not going to predict it," they'll sort of at least give their best guess, which apparently you're not supposed to do. So let's talk about where these two diverged and why the Jewish tradition doesn't see Jesus as the Messiah. Let's talk about the rejection of that figure as the Messiah descended from David. So why is that? What's the problem?
Well, I guess the question is, who has the burden of proof in this situation?
Sure, obviously the Christians do, yeah.
In other words, I can believe that the kind of hostility that's described in the New Testament happened. Paul shows up in a synagogue, right? And people are like, what? Why in the world, are we supposed to believe this? I can absolutely believe that happened. But I would say that it's very difficult to get a sense of what exactly the Jews living at the time when the New Testament was being created would have thought about a Messiah, because we only have actual statements about this from later on. And I would say that the first person, I can't remember if I mentioned this before or after our little adventure, but really the first person to, in Jewish tradition, I think, to sort of seem to take on that role is Bar Kokhba. Are you familiar?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So I said, I think the last time we spoke, that even after the destruction of the temple in 70, there was still a sizable Jewish settlement within the country, even in Jerusalem itself. But that after another war that happened about 65 years later, under the Emperor Hadrian, that was the results of that were much more devastating, and that was really the first time that many, or I should say most of the Jewish population was displaced and wound up living in other parts of the Mediterranean. But the leader of that rebellion was this man named Bar Kokhba. And we actually have a amount of information about this, both from Jewish sources, but also actually from at least one Greek historian that I am aware of who discusses this.
What time period is this? So after the Second Temple, that was 70. So yeah, roughly around that time?
And 135.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's actually at least one story in the Talmud, I think that's where it is, that there was a dispute among the leading rabbis of the time about whether Bar Kokhba should be regarded as a Messiah, which shows that, if nothing else, by then you do have this idea of possibly a semi-miraculous figure as opposed to simply a descendant of David, because Bar Kokhba was considered exceptionally brave and strong and powerful. And of course, in the end, he was defeated. But that's really, I would say, in Jewish terms, of this notion as a result or under a Messiah. But I should emphasize that, if it wasn't already clear from my description of Bar Kokhba, that what we're talking about is a very different kind of a figure from Jesus. Now, it's very possible that part of the issue here is that we're reading back this later idea, since we don't have Jewish sources about this any earlier than the Talmud. It's certainly possible that 100 years before that, if you'd asked Jews what a Messiah ought to be like, that maybe they wouldn't have said particularly, I'm sure they would have connected him to David, but not necessarily, he has to be a general, or a military leader. So that's a whole open question.
Right.
And there's also in some of our Jewish sources, also from around the earlier Talmudic period, we do have this idea actually of two messiahs at the same time, which I guess sort of deals with this notion. In other words, one of them is more like the general type, okay? Mm-hmm. And one of them is more like a spiritual. So you have what's called the Messiah, son of Joseph, not that Joseph, mm-hmm. But actually the biblical, the Joseph in Egypt, Joseph. Mm-hmm. And I believe the Messiah, son of Levi, because Levi was the tribe that produced the priests.
Yep.
So Bar Kokhba, for example, I don't believe was a member of the priestly tribe, unlike the Maccabees, who we talked about last time.
Yeah.
So that might also be an element here, like for people who went to Asmoneans, right, as kings, which they had been, but no longer, but not in the next round as it were anyone else. Then the idea of the two messiahs would be a way, I suppose, of reconciling that problem. You could have the sort of more, it's like you have the king and you have the Archbishop of Canterbury, if you like.
Right. Yeah, so, well, sort of the sort of theocracies in Iran was what I was thinking. Like you have the prime minister, the president, and you have the theocratical leader, the right. imams kind of thing.
Right.
And so was there sort of disagreements? Like did people back Bar Kokhba as the Messiah? Was that a push? Kind of, did we have a rival Jesus is what I'm asking.
You have a rival Jesus?
Yeah.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
If only, well, certainly not in retrospect, because he never occupied the kind of place in Jewish thought that Jesus did, and no one ever, to my knowledge, which is interesting actually when you think about it, no one ever started up a separate group or a cult, which actually is not true of all later Jewish messiahs. In fact, I can think of two relatively recent ones that actually did produce their own groups that at least one of which still exists today in some form, I think. So the first one was named Shabtai Tzvi. Have you heard of this gentleman?
No.
Yeah. So this is the 17th, I guess, century. He basically declared himself a messiah. And like I said, after the Spanish expulsion, basically the ancestors of the people that are today called Sephardim, okay? The word Sfarad means Spain, okay? So a lot of the Jews today that are called Sephardim are people whose ancestors lived in Spain, and from there went on to live in places like Turkey, Greece, North Africa. And so a lot of those people became followers of this gentleman. And in the end, he basically, his profile became a little too high, and he wound up getting into trouble with the Ottoman court in Istanbul, in Constantinople.
Yeah, and they were a powerhouse during that time, weren't they? That was
yeah, very much so.
17th
This is after they, right. So he was basically given the choice to back down and convert to Islam or to be killed, and he did convert. And his followers, some of them basically did what often happens in these situations, which is say, well, he didn't really, he's only whatever, right.
Fake news. Fake news.
It's a strategic move, yeah.
Right.
And he'll be back.
Right. Yeah, of course he will. And who was the one that still has followers around it at the moment?
So there was a man in 19th century Tsarist Russia. Actually, it might have been Poland. You know what? This is not something I know a great deal about. Some friends of mine will get angry if they see this because they do know about it. But he's not actually that well known. I would say that Jews tend to be embarrassed nowadays about episodes like this. Well, yeah. So this man's name was Jacob Frank. I don't know if you've heard of Isaac Bashevis Singer, he's the most famous Yiddish novelist. He wrote Yentl, that became a movie.
Okay, yep.
Yeah, so I believe he wrote a novel. I believe he did, or one of the Yiddish authors definitely wrote a novel about this whole episode, like 75 years ago. But this was in the 19th century, and this man, Jacob Frank, attracted a group, and they became kind of very, I would say even more a little like the Qumran group. They were very ascetic, okay? I'm not even sure they were allowed to be married, in fact.
Wow.
Yes, and in the end, I can't remember if he died directly as a result or if it was kind of like a Waco, if you're familiar, situation that happened in Texas like 20 years ago, where there was like a last stand against the authorities. I think there actually was. In fact, now, if I'm remembering correctly, and forgive me if I'm confusing this with another episode, but I believe that in the end, his followers locked themselves in like a house and set it on fire.
Oh dear.
Yeah. But not all of them, because as I said, I do believe that even today there are people, and there's a name for this group, but I can't remember what it is. And they're not Jews in any recognizable sense. I'm not even sure they were back then, particularly. But his followers were Jews. I mean, and he himself was, and so that's maybe the most recent example within the Jewish world of this kind of a thing.
Right. Well, I mean, outside the Jewish world, there's plenty of people calling themselves Jesus.
Sure.
There was an Australian calling himself Jesus. I remember that from a little while ago. So yeah, okay, and that's just weird. That's just weird. And so the whole idea that the Messiah didn't come, or the Messiah has yet to be seen in Jewish tradition, there are people backing other horses, even if there's only a few of them, kind of thing, besides Jesus. And obviously the mainstream is that we haven't seen a Messiah at all, I believe.
Yeah. I mean, you also have to bear in mind that, after all, centuries of hostility and persecution, mostly in one direction. Well, the hostility, I would say, was mutual, but the persecution, it's very, if none of that had happened, I suppose it's an interesting question whether more Jews might have felt less ambivalent about this idea if someone else had come along. If they hadn't been basically given the choice of recognizing this one particular Messiah, right, or having to suffer for it. But what I was saying a while ago, about the Jewish background, right, to the initial apostles, right, and the initial mission of Paul. So that Paul, right, that you're familiar with the whole episode in Acts where he's in conflict with, I think the term is the stoloi, the pillars of the Jerusalem church, right? James and the others, right? They don't want him telling non-Jews that they can become Christians without also becoming Jews.
Right.
Meaning being circumcised, observing the food laws.
Yeah.
Right. And he, of course, wanted to be able to do that. In the end, he won out. So by the time of the rebellion in 70, the church in Jerusalem had grown far enough apart from the rest of the Jewish community that they decided not to take part in the rebellion. And I believe they actually moved to where? Damascus, maybe? Or I think Damascus. They actually left the region, and from then on, certainly within like 100 years, right, the idea of Jewish Christians, there were still some, right? We know because some of the church fathers mentioned them, among other heretical sects, that they really had become the odd man out to both Jews and Christians. So from then on.
Do you think it was the splitting of geography between them, much like sort of languages become separated by geography? Do you think it was the distancing of the Christians that sort of gave rise to a more distinct form of religion for the two?
Well, I suppose, to the degree, and I guess this is a big question, but to the degree that Christianity from that point on started to absorb all sorts of other
like the pagan religions and things like that.
Right. And then again, it's also important to point out that even from early times, Christianity had a base in the Hellenistic world, in Greek culture and thought, that Jews also had, but among the Jews, that actually died out pretty early on, I would say, because I think last time I spoke about this, how writers like Josephus were unknown, in many cases, literally, to Jews until, say, the 17th to 18th centuries, when there were Jews who started to become more acculturated in the European world and the classical culture, because Jews no longer read Greek and they were unfamiliar with that world, and they viewed it as they were hostile to it. Whereas Christians, of course, kept that. The Septuagint, right, the Greek translation, you may know, was written by Jews and for Jews, right? But again, Jews stopped reading it, by, I don't know, say, I would imagine the 4th or 5th century, if not before that. And it became an entirely Christian thing. So the degree to which Christianity was influenced, on the one hand, by, say, like Northern European religion, right? Or on the other hand, by Greek beliefs, that really passed the Jews by. And the focus of Jewish culture was much more, for a long time, in Babylonia. And there are actually people who look into the degree to which, even in the Bible itself, and certainly afterward, Jewish beliefs were influenced by Babylonian ones, by the Zoroastrianism, right? And
Yep.
There is actually, it's interesting. So there's actually two Talmuds. I don't know if you want to know this. But
so just quickly, I know that Talmud is the readings of the rabbinic traditions of the text, correct? If I got that right?
Not exactly.
Okay.
Basically,
explain the difference between sort of the Tanakh and the Talmud.
Okay. So the Talmud as a work dates back to about 1,500 years ago, a bit less even. But it's not a book in the sense that someone sat down and wrote it. It's a collection of material that was gathered over a very long period of time and was not written down. You may remember we talked about this too, right? About how for a long time Jews didn't think that anything other than the Bible itself or other sacred texts should be committed to paper or parchment. So the Talmud was oral for a very long time, and it only started to get written down maybe around, 12 or 1,300 years ago, which the most normal people would seem like a long time, but in Jewish terms, not so much. So basically what you have is traditions going back theoretically about as far as the time of the New Testament, or even a bit farther. Very hard to say. And then gathered and reworked and repeated. And over time, there were basically different, if you like, schools, Jewish schools. I don't mean philosophical schools, I mean literal schools,
right?
Which were established in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple in different places in the land of Israel. And they were led by basically the first rabbis, and their students became then subsequent generations of rabbis. And these are the figures whose names appear in the Talmud. And their teachings, the things they told their students and their students then passed on, were collected and recorded and interacted, if you like, because after all, okay, so let's say the Talmud is broadly organized as a book of laws, okay? In the sense that its different sections deal with different aspects of Jewish practice. And I should say that Jewish practice has always been much more central than Jewish belief. And in fact, there's nothing comparable to the Talmud in Jewish history, which addresses what Jews do or should believe.
So is it sort of how the early rabbinic sort of figures said that the laws should be interpreted? Is that what they're sort of doing? They're saying, hey, this is what this law says and this is how it should be interpreted. Is that what they're sort of doing?
Sort of.
Okay.
It's so, okay. I was actually going to mention this anyway. So the Bible itself, right, it's not really a law book. I mean, it's many things, but it has laws in it.
Stories, yeah.
It has poetry. It does have theology, But it's not coherent in any obvious sense. So this leads to problems not only for people who would like there to be Jewish theology, but also for people who would like there to be Jewish law, because it's not systematic, and it sometimes has rules which could be taken as contradicting one another,
Sure.
either explicitly or even just implicitly, because you might have a law which if you unpacked it would have consequences for the first law in terms of how it's observed. Okay. Now, the schools that I mentioned a moment ago, they produced their own, if you like, codes of rules governing all sorts of situations. So, for example, two most obvious ones: how do you observe the Sabbath? Right? What does it mean not to work on the Sabbath? Okay.
Yes. Yep.
And what does it mean to be pure? Because the Bible takes it for granted that there's all sorts of states of purity and impurity. So these collections of laws that were developed in these rabbinic academies, as I said, they were initially oral, and there were people whose job, in fact, was to memorize them. I think I think that this happens with the Quran, if I'm not something like this. No, if I'm not mistaken, there are people who dedicate themselves to memorizing. Maybe the Hadith as well. I don't know. Anyway, so for hundreds of years, that was the situation, and gradually these laws, people wanted to expand upon these laws. The main collection of these laws is called the Mishnah, if you've ever heard that term.
I have, yes.
Okay. And it was basically codified, though not written down, actually, by around 250 CE. And the rules in the Mishnah are simply stated. They are grouped by the subject matter, but otherwise they're basically fairly concise rules of the kind that you might find in any ancient, say, in Roman law, which I've had the pleasure of having to read some of in my own work, or in it's basically legal prescriptions. So, for example, what's a good example? The very first law of the very first book of the Mishnah is so that the most famous Jewish prayer is called the Shema, Hear, O Israel, right? It's in Deuteronomy. Okay. So Jews are meant to say that every day. And so the first section of the Mishnah deals with blessings. What do you say and when do you say them? Not just for food, for all sorts of occasions.
Right.
And
so marriages, in ceremonies.
Yeah, all sorts of, right.
Yeah.
So, there's a standard prayer book which contains lots and lots of these, among other things.
That sounds a lot more rigid than Christianity, which basically is just make up whatever you want on the spot kind of thing. Like if you say grace, it really, as long as you've got their favorite word at the end, you can go buck wild kind of thing.
Yes, that's an interesting point, because maybe until now I've been giving people the impression that other things aside, Judaism tends to be more. In certain respects, I would say it's definitely much more abstract and do it yourself, than Christianity. Right. But others much less so, because after all, it is very much about practice, and prayer is definitely a part of that practice. In fact, well, if I get to it, there's a joke I was explaining. Anyway, so the first rule in the Mishnah is, from what time can you say the Shema? In other words, you're supposed to say it in the morning and at night. Okay, so what does morning mean in the context of when you're allowed to say it? Because that has to be clarified, right? It's not just like whatever you think is morning. Anyway, there are lots and lots of rules. Another example would be your film. You know what a menorah is, right?
Yeah.
Like,
The
okay.
candelabra. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So one might ask oneself, right? Do you light one new candle each night, or as in fact Jews do nowadays, do you light one additional candle each night? So the first night it's one candle, the second night it's two, right? Up until 8.
Okay.
Do you light them from left going to right, or from right going to left? Do you start with the newest one?
I'm really sorry, Peter. This sounds really petty. Like, what order do you light the candles is a bit... That's really minutiae, isn't it? I mean...
Yes, it is.
Okay, just checking. Yeah.
I mean, look, there's at least one story in the New Testament that I can think of offhand, right? In which I'm sure there's more than one, right? In which this sort of attitude is precisely the sort of thing that Jesus is criticizing, right?
Right.
Although maybe attitude isn't the right word, because after all, and I can't stress this enough, that the New Testament was written by people that consider Jews to be at best their competition and at worst their enemies. Okay, so the way that Pharisees, for example, are portrayed has, really very little to do with whatever else we might know about them from other sources. Except I will say that they did consider themselves more careful than some other Jews about their level of observance. And I am willing to believe that there would be circumstances in which other Jews would say, who do those guys think they are? They're not, are they so much better than us? I can absolutely believe that. The problem is that
I suppose I could imagine a religious war start over, what's the correct side to start on the menorah or something like that. I suppose it does avoid those sort of splits to a certain degree.
Well, yes. The truth is that there really haven't ever been, I would say, the kinds of, because after all, it isn't theology. It is important, but it's not theology, right? And
right.
like the kind of, I think I remember reading once, there was this whole Arian issue in Christianity, right, where there was around the time of Constantine, where the question was, were the members of the Trinity composed of the same substance or a similar substance? I think I'm sure you can ask one of your Christian friends about that. But I think
that's a difference I wanted to get to. But sorry, go ahead. I did want to get to the Trinity, but well, maybe I should bring it up now. So I know that the Jewish people reject the Trinity, and what I don't see a whole load of values shared between the Judeo and the Christian kind of thing. So where are these values coming from? What values do they actually have in common?
Well, like I said before, nowadays, I would say it's mainly a question of the culture war and the feeling that we have more in common relative to secular people or other kinds, I guess, of spirituality, or then we do.
Well, I'd say it's more, when you're talking about cultural, it's kind of the Western culture is who the Jewish people more identify with than sort of a more Eastern or Middle Eastern culture.
Yes, although, well, if by Eastern you mean Asian, then definitely.
Yeah.
Although it's kind of a joke, but with some truth to it, that when Jews tend to adopt other practices, they tend to be Buddhist.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's because Buddhism feels more, I don't know, in terms of what I was saying before about the absence of theology and all of that. Maybe Buddhism feels a little more friendly to Jews
perhaps, yeah.
than, you know. I will say this: I've encountered online, you know, and occasionally in real life, Messianic Jews, and just to be clear that however traditional or not most Jews might be, the idea of all things becoming Christian is a really hard pill to swallow. And of course, a lot of it has to do with the history, you know, between the groups, but quite apart from that, just this whole notion, I think, that, you know, that the Hebrew Bible and Jewish tradition and Jewish history need to be radically reinterpreted really doesn't sit well, you know. I suppose it's like how a Native American might feel knowing that there are these guys that go out on camping trips, you know, and they take out drums, you know, and they sit in a circle around a fire, and it's like, you know, maybe you should get your own culture, you know. I mean, I remember reading a letter in a newspaper about that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, how do they feel about things like people saying that because I've heard a lot of Christians go on about how the Ark was prophesizing Jesus, and that the story of the binding of Isaac was a prophecy about Jesus. So how do they feel about that kind of thing? Which I've never gotten how that happens. You know, I don't see it as a prophecy because it's very vague, and I think it's just a reinterpretation. But they certainly do say it a lot.
Yeah. Well, do they literally? I think I saw a few minutes of you talking a couple of days ago. Was it with a priest? Is it Charles?
Oh, that was on Father Charles's channel, but I think it was Christian. It's a very easy name to remember. It's Christian the Christian, who was talking about sort of how he squares modern science with the stories in the Old Testament that, you know, obviously don't sort of fit that well in with our modern scientific understanding, especially evolution.
Right. Well, there's this term, I guess the term is typology, where you want to read into, right, backward, as it were, into these earlier texts, this later meaning, like a foreshadowing, right?
Yeah.
And I think I said the last time we spoke that it's very exceptional, the sort of thing that you find in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? That you would take things mentioned in the Bible and connect them with your own immediate experience. That's really not the general practice in Jewish thinking. And so I'd say both in traditional Jewish terms and in modern scholarly terms, I would say the idea of taking the Hebrew Bible as anything other than a collection of texts from a long period of time produced by an ancient Near Eastern semi-agricultural monarchy, okay, which toward the end was exiled and had to reconstitute itself. The idea of taking all of that and turning it into some sort of coherent single message, because I think I've pretty often heard Christians say things along those lines too, right? Like the Bible has one, you know, which to me is very odd. And not only that, but that message then looks forward, right, to the events of the first century Roman Empire, you know, is completely uncalled for and unjustifiable. And again, I think the idea that, well, you know, I don't want to suggest a secret key to the Bible, or that they also aren't interpreting it. They absolutely are. And of course, if nothing else, because of all we talked about the last time about the difference between Israelites and Jews, right? Mm-hmm. Jews today, you know, again, who aren't particularly scholarly minded, let's say, or I should say academic minded, you know, they may very well read the stories of Abraham and Joseph, and they'll think, you know, those are Jews, right? Those are my people, you know, and we're the same, because they don't have a sense of historical change or development. So I'm not saying the Jews don't do that, but the idea that Christians would then come along and say, well, you know, sorry, but you got it all wrong. Mm-hmm. You know, this is our story, right? Our covenant, you know, it's a big hurdle, I would say, in I think develop a real mutual respect between the two communities.
Well, I mean, something came up in my mind, which was sort of, I mean, are they retconning for Jesus, basically, just going back, changing the history? That's instantly what came to mind. But you mentioned the covenant, and I really wanted to ask, how similar is the Deuteronomy and things like that, and the things that it has in the Old Testament in Christian tradition? How similar is that to the books in Jewish tradition?
I'm sorry. How is what similar to the Jewish tradition?
How similar is the Old Testament to the, you know, Torah and the other books of the Tanakh?
Well, the Old Testament more or less means the Tanakh.
Right. So there's
no differences. Use, of course, but,
There's no differences whatsoever.
I'm still not sure what you're getting at. In other words, you mean the Torah as opposed to the rest of the Bible?
Well, I mean, they've got the same sort of stories in, correct? I mean, at the same, like the Pentateuch.
Oh, you mean the Christian version as opposed to the Jewish version?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, right. I'm sorry, I misunderstood you.
No, that's okay. I'm probably just using the wrong terminology. I apologize.
No. The only major issue as far as that goes is an issue of canon, right? Because you know, there's different churches, right?
Yeah.
Not only include different books, but also the order of the books. So the order in which the Tanakh is set is different than, I believe, Protestant canons, or maybe all Christian canons actually, of the Hebrew Bible. Whether the texts themselves are different, I would say no, except insofar as there are, of course, translation issues.
Translation, yeah.
Like the most famous one of all, you know, which is the one in Isaiah about the virgin giving birth, right?
Right.
You familiar with this issue?
Yeah, it doesn't virgin just mean unmarried woman. It doesn't actually mean...
It's a young woman, right?
Yeah.
Right. You know, actually, I was going to say before, since you were asking me about prophecy, with the exception of the stuff from the latest stage of the Bible, from the period of the exile, where they are looking to a new, you know, restoration, or even more than that, prophecies are very much fixed within a specific historical context. So again, to as you said, retcon, right? In other words, if the New Testament is going to quote like the one we just mentioned, right? How does it go? In Isaiah 54, is it? And his name shall be called Emmanuel, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that whole bit, you know, is again referring to a specific historical moment. Isaiah lived in the 7th century. He was an associate of the king of Judah, Hezekiah. There was a war with the Assyrians. we actually don't always know the specific, of course, historical background, because people who wrote this stuff assumed, as often
Everybody
happens,
knew.
right?
Yeah.
So 2,000 years later, it's a little harder.
Yeah.
But for example, is it Isaiah? I think it's Isaiah who says that there's going to be some sort of conspiracy, basically to overthrow the king, and they're going to put in this man, and they give this name, which I guess is meant to be sort of a code name, like not the guy's real name, and we don't know who that was.
Yeah.
Right. So the whole notion of taking these allusions, right, and then reading back into them, 600 years
You can
later.
just assume whoever we want in that position. I mean, you could put nearly anybody in there.
Right. Which of course has been done, because as I said before, even as recently as the 19th century. Although, the truth is, I would have to look into this, but it is an interesting question. Whether, or to what degree, I should say, people like Shabtai Tzvi and Jacob Frank actually said, well, these verses refer to me. I think he actually did something, Shabtai Tzvi. I think he actually in some way did. But then again, he was living at a time when there was a long Christian history of this. So for all I know, his own, even though he lived in the Muslim world, maybe his own attitude toward the Hebrew Bible had been to some degree colored by that notion of, taking these prophecies and retconning them for your own uses. It's an interesting question.
Would the people around the time of Jesus, so the Jewish people who sort of proclaimed him Messiah, would they have known about these prophecies?
I mean, they knew the Bible.
Right. But you'd presume that they would know that the prophecy says he's born of a virgin, or, mistranslated, but born of a young woman and things like that.
Well, that's an interesting example, because I think the general consensus nowadays is that 3 of the Gospels were originally written in Greek, and one of them, Matthew, might have been written in Aramaic, because it uses certain expressions that don't really sound right in Greek, but that do sound right in Hebrew or in Aramaic.
Okay.
But the term virgin is used in the Septuagint. So those Christians who read Greek, that's what they would have read. So when deciding how to tell Jesus' story, that would have been one of many things, like, riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, having the palm fronds, the Hosanna. These things all relate to the Festival of Tabernacles, right?
How does the donkey relate to tabernacles?
I think that the story, again, I think it's in Zechariah.
Yeah, Zechariah, yeah,
I think that's when it's set. I think he sets the story, because I think the War of Gog and Magog is set at that time of the year. I might be mixing up a couple of things, but I think so. And that's why a lot of the specific associations of Jesus have to do with that holiday, and of course also with Passover, because that's the whole story of the end of his life. But it always interests me when Christians will say, and admittedly, I mean, the story is said, the crucifixion is said at the time of Passover. I don't remember if any of the Gospels explicitly make the connection between the crucifixion and the Passover sacrifice, but certainly nowadays people do, and it's in a Jewish context, it rings odd, because the Passover sacrifice is not an atonement, unlike others which specifically are, like the sacrifice on the Day of Atonement, which is the origin of the concept of the scapegoat. They were literally, in the Bible, it says, so you take a goat, send it out into the desert with all of the sins on it, right? So that's an atonement. So the idea that the Passover sacrifice, which is simply a sacrifice to commemorate the Israelites leaving Egypt, would, so I assume that because there was a historical element in this, with Jesus and when this actually happened. And so they were they had to deal with that, right? They couldn't very well say, well, it actually happened on the Day of Atonement and be 6 months away. If they had complete freedom, I guess they could have done that. Maybe they would have, but I guess they were limited. So they had to deal with what they had. And they knew that anyone with any Jewish background, for the first 100 years, say, right, maybe less, they would say, what do you mean? That's not,
well, let's talk more about prophecy, because the one that always bewilders me is the born in Bethlehem, because we know that Jesus came from Nazareth. That was pretty well established. So do you give much credence to you have to return home to your place of birth, knowing about the Roman Empire? I know that's sort of your speciality. Did the Romans ever get people to return to the place of their birth? I think that as a census would be a pretty bad move on the Romans' part.
Yeah, no, I'm not. In fact, the notion of a census, was not really something I think generally associated with the Roman Empire as such. Something is nagging at me that I saw recently, which might have suggested that certain provinces might have done something like that. I can tell you that only in the later Roman Empire, starting, say, in the later 3rd century CE, do we find the development of a more elaborate bureau with archives in Rome and officials whose job was to keep track of things like commodity prices and correspondence. So, for example, if you're familiar with this whole Pliny the Younger, who was the governor of the Roman province of Bithynia for a few years around the year 100, they didn't have professionalism, right? Pliny, you didn't go to school. They didn't have a Kennedy School of Administration, if you know what that is. They weren't trained to be administrators, but people, I guess, who were considered intelligent, and capable. So Pliny, and also, of course, there was a lot of, what would you call it? Nepotism, or more generally, just,
nothing changes yet. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so Pliny was one of those people, and he was sent to Bithynia. And we have 10 books of his correspondence. Now, they weren't collected in his lifetime. 9 of the 10 books are simply his personal letters to other people. And it would be nice if we knew more about how, they wound up being preserved initially by the people he wrote them to, and then eventually collected. I'm sure it was a lengthy process, just as with Cicero's letters or any collection of letters. But the 10th book is his correspondence with Trajan. Trajan is considered one of the better emperors.
Yeah.
Is not given to fits of madness. He was serious. He tried to, certainly in terms of the Roman state, if not necessarily other people, But anyway, Pliny corresponded with Trajan, and we have those letters, and presumably Rome, whose job it was to keep track of the imperial correspondence, preserved both his letters and Trajan's response. They would keep a copy, and they were then finally found their way into medieval world, and from there to us. So the letters tend to be amusing to people who meet the Roman Empire, because the impression from Trajan's responses that he thought Pliny was maybe getting a bit too, how shall I put it? He would write to Trajan about all sorts of things that Trajan thought he could just as well have decided by himself.
So he kind of thought he was sort of incompetent, that he didn't know, or that he was just, he's like you ever had one of those people who's new on a job and they just keep asking you questions and it's like, yeah, just do this the obvious kind of thing. You know how to do this, right?
It's more like that, because he'll say to him, well, Pliny, as you know, or as I've already, and the thing is, Pliny was, became a respected writer. I guess we have no way of knowing whether other governors of the time even wrote any letters to the emperors under whom they served. It's reasonable to assume that they did, because after all, there was an official, as I said, in Rome whose job was to look after the emperor's correspondence. But whether they did so in a way that Pliny did, that's another question. For example, the main city, Bithynia, had been part of the Hellenistic world. They spoke Greek, and the main city was called Nicomedia. I don't know if there's a city there now. I think there might be, though. I don't know what it's called. Probably has a Turkish name. But there was a group. They wanted to basically set up a volunteer fire department, and because again, ancient administration and bureaucracy was not. They didn't have anything like what we would call a policing system. Well, not to any such degree. A policing system. They did have a justice system. They had courts, but it was much more.
Their army as a policing system. Was it the legionnaires that were sort of set up as police?
I mean, in the provinces, okay. I mean, peacekeeping, if you want to use that term, yeah, in a kind of slightly sinister way. But for Roman citizens themselves, anyway, they wanted to set up. These people were not Roman citizens. The people in Bithynia, or not most of them, they were simply the local provincials. They wanted to set up a fire station, and the Romans had their own laws basically for dealing with provincials, which were not necessarily as developed or as tolerant as the ones that had developed over the centuries for Roman citizens themselves. Which is why you may remember in the New Testament when Paul is arrested. Well, it's not precisely that, but it is interesting that he points out that he's a Roman citizen and he wants to be sent to Rome, because a Roman citizen had the right of appeal to the emperor, which other people did not. Okay. Mm-hmm. So these Bithynians wanted to set up a fire station, and the Romans had a long history of suspicion of groups that met in private, and a very long tradition, I should say, which of course also comes into play in talking about a religious group that A, doesn't have its own historical tradition, right? B, seems to be made up of Jews who we already know, or at least we thought we did. So who are these folks? And C, when it has its religious ceremonies, it has them in houses. You're aware of this, right?
Not really, no.
Yeah. When Paul, take a look. When Paul writes letters to these churches, what does that mean? He's writing to people. Say hello to so-and-so, right? Or thank, so-and-so who's like our philanthropist, our donor, right? Mm-hmm. Or there's one woman whose name escapes me, right? Who's, I think, seems to be in charge of one of these communities. So they met in each other's houses, right? And a lot of them didn't have any money, and maybe one who had a nice house, would provide for this, right? But I don't think
These are the epistles that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Oh.
There
No, I
were
wasn't
synagogues
aware
at
of
that point because Paul went to visit them, right? But
Yeah.
there were not churches in that
Churches,
sense.
right, of course, because they wouldn't have the actual infrastructure up yet. That I mean, it
Right.
was that new, right? Yeah.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So were
So
these acting like patrons towards him, like providing sort of financial support in his house for these meetings and all of this kind of stuff? Were they sort of patrons of the religion?
that's my impression. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I mean, the Jews
Interesting.
had
I
the
didn't
same
know that.
thing. I mean,
Oh, really?
it's
Okay.
funny because, for example, one of the first, or possibly the very first synagogue ever, we don't know, but the oldest one we know of was actually in Jerusalem when the temple was still standing, even because synagogues were never seen as being the equivalent of the temple. The temple had sacrifices, it had priests, it had people who played musical instruments, whereas synagogues were places where you would go and you would pray and you would study. It was another kind of a thing. But we actually have a carved Greek inscription from this very early synagogue, which is in honor of this man, apparently was the main donor.
Okay.
And to this day, if you go into any synagogue, is that a fair? Yeah, I think it's a fair statement. You are liable to see it somewhere in there, a plaque along the lines of, Max and Lynette Cohen of Miami, Florida, generously, donated. You see, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like that. It's an old, very old. I'm sure churches have the same, hospitals, right? It's a very
Probably,
common.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The Reagan Library and things like that. Absolutely. We always do that these days. Yeah, that's interesting though. And so, yeah, obviously, and Robin points out they were hiding somewhat from the Jewish leaders as well. They were sort of trying to keep a low profile. So how tense were things between the Christians and the early Christians, of course? So people like Paul and the Jewish people.
Well, if we're still talking about the period when the Christians were also Jews, that's.
I mean, were they seen as a heresy, or were they seen as sort of, oh, this is just another offshoot, like the Pharisees or something like that? Were they just seen as relatively innocuous?
I would say not innocuous.
Right.
We don't have. Okay. Again, the Talmud, as I said, right, was compiled a very long time after this period. So it's a lot of its traditions. There are people whose scholarly output is basically trying to do archaeology, as it were, on the Talmud and try to get a sense of when the layers developed. And it's not like it's in any obvious sequence. There's this material woven together because no one cared when it was created about that, no one said, well, we have to keep these things separate because this comes from 200 years after that. That wasn't an issue. But there are hints about this period that, and the operative word is actually the Hebrew word min, which means, yeah. Now, it's actually funny. So there's this term that creationists use, baraminology, right? Like when they talk about it. It's the same word, actually. It's literally the same word because in the Bible, the word min means kind, right? That's the word kind. We're going to talk about kind. Okay. But
so are you saying the same meme that's like the idea, like the meme, like Richard Dawkins meme?
No. That's
no. Okay, just it sounded exactly the same. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. Anyway, they use this word in the Talmud to refer to people that we would probably call heretics. Okay. But again, because the later stages of the Talmud were actually composed in Babylonia, it's not at all clear to what degree they may be talking about other groups entirely, or whether they are talking about groups like the Christians or other people in the land of Israel while the Jews were still there hundreds of years before. But there's pretty good reason to think that at least some of it did have to do with them. And it's worth bearing in mind that certainly Christians thought so, because for a period in the Middle Ages, they went out of their way to burn as many copies of the Talmud as they could get their hands on, under the impression, under the impression that
problem with the Talmud. Okay.
Yeah. And even today,
is that because it conflicts with their idea of, well, we're not going to adhere to all these old laws kind of thing, where we want to do, you know, whatever. Like I think who was it? Was it Paul or Peter that said, hey, I can eat shellfish now kind of thing? I think it was Peter, from memory.
Well, I know Paul, in that discussion about admitting non-Jews without requiring them to give up any of that stuff, I know Paul definitely took that attitude that it doesn't matter what you eat, and that you don't have to tell these prospective Christians that they have to give stuff up or become circumcised, of course, which is, you know, the one thing that, especially because we're talking about adults, and, you know, it's not a simple thing. But no, I don't think the Talmud, I mean, okay, let's put it this way. I suppose that you could say that for Christians, it symbolized everything that they hated about Jews, whatever that might have been, right? I mean, sometimes they simply killed the Jews themselves, you know, of course, or humiliated them, or whatever it might be. But maybe this was an easier thing to get permission from the local authorities to do. I don't know. But in any case, there definitely were, there definitely was and is the belief that the Talmud contains all sorts of evil machinations, and it is true that there are some, and I would say compared to the whole output of, you know, post-biblical Jewish tradition, a very small number of references to Christians or to Jesus that are definitely critical and uncomplimentary, and even maybe blasphemous by Christian standards. I don't know that it's on me to apologize for that, or on Jews in general to apologize for that. There was definitely a long history of polemic on both sides. In Spain, in Christian Spain, there were these. There was a period where sometimes Jews were forced to get up in front of, basically defend themselves against
like in trial
Christians.
Kind of thing.
Yes, basically, the Jewish community was expected to justify its existence in terms of Christian theology. So, you know, in a situation like that, anyway, I'm not here to really, frankly, to criticize or justify anyone, but simply to provide more of a historical backdrop. But definitely in the Middle Ages, the Talmud was considered a heretical work.
Fair game, yeah. Well, I mean, there was a lot of things that were considered fair game in the Middle Ages. You know, the Cathars spring to mind, for instance, that were wiped out. But one thing I did want to ask is the Christians sort of have, and we've sort of talked about this new covenant with the Christians, and that's their excuse for, hey, we don't have to follow these laws. And obviously, you've said that groundwork was laid in very early Christianity with Peter and Paul sort of saying, hey, we're not going to circumcise, and you can skip the Jewish part to become Christian. But what is obviously the Jewish people don't follow the old, laws from Deuteronomy and Exodus kind of thing. So how do they reconcile that with, sort of, like some of the laws, like if your son is unruly, then he's taken out before the temple and stoned, and things like that we obviously don't do. Is that made up for in the Talmud? Is that what happens, like that they reinterpret these laws differently?
Actually, to a degree, yes, I would say.
Okay.
Well, okay, so I guess you could say two things. First, it is a question of interpretation. For example, this might be the most famous example.
Okay.
The law about the rebellious son. Okay.
The prodigal son?
I think that's in the New Testament.
Is that? That is New Testament. You're right. Yeah. Yes, the rebellious son, drunken and lazy,
yes.
and yeah. I know the one. Yep.
So the Talmud, or I should say Jewish law in general, interpreted a law like this in very strict and specific and narrow terms, with the idea that it would not actually be carried out in practice. In other words, in order to fulfill the conditions described in the Bible. Now, mind you, I would say that when you're talking about laws like this, it's really an open question whether they were ever observed this way, right? Because after all, the Bible, as we have it, is a product of the end of an independent Israelite kingdom when these laws were theoretically in force, and would not have been written down at the time of the kingdom itself. And also, the second thing I was going to get to, so many of these laws are either not applicable or not practicable once the Jews no longer had the temple and no longer had control over their own, their own criminal law, I guess you would say, really.
So at the exile to Babylon, they obviously didn't have the authority to make any decisions whatsoever.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, because,
okay,
I mean, like we said in our last discussion, what we find in the centuries after they return from Babylonia is this elite of high priests, right, and teachers, and they obviously did develop laws and traditions, although I imagine that it's an open question. I mean, you're familiar with the concept of the Sanhedrin, right?
Remind me. It definitely rings a bell. I can't bring it to mind. I'm sorry, it's late here. I cannot bring it to mind.
No, it's fine. So the Sanhedrin was a Jewish court. The word itself is actually from Greek, and it's not something that existed until the time of the Second Temple.
Okay.
And the thing of it is that we have two main descriptions of the Sanhedrin, which really don't agree on what it was and what it did. One of them is in rabbinic literature, where the Sanhedrin is basically described as a law court that settles questions of practice when they arise, new situations or conflicts, whatever they may be. So, for example, the whole notion that under the period of the monarchy, the Israelite monarchy, family relationship was determined by who your father was, what tribe you belonged to. But after the Babylonian exile, Jewish identity from then and to this day goes through the line of the mother. And the usual explanation, which I have no particular reason to doubt, is because after enough time had passed in which it became a real issue that that the father of a given member of the Jewish community might have been their mother's rapist from outside, right? You know, in war and in so forth. So that became a very real issue. So this is a situation in which the law has to decide what you're going to do. Anyway, the Sanhedrin is described, as I said, in rabbinic literature as a, I think the term is, well, it's something more like a legislative body, okay, like the American Senate, okay? Whereas in the New Testament, it's much more of a trial court, because there is one trial, right, in the New Testament,
So
the trial of
judicial
Jesus.
system. Sure, yeah.
Right. So this is a real problem. Now, the fact that the New Testament as a source is much closer to the period than the texts we have in rabbinic tradition is important in understanding this. And we do know that the actual amount of control that the Jewish community in Judea had over its own laws varied, I should say its own criminal laws, varied under Roman administration, which I imagine was true of all of the Roman provinces, because as I said a few minutes ago, provincial administration led to the creation of different codes of law, both for interactions between provincials and Roman citizens, and between provincials and other provincials. Okay, so there was not one single body. They solved the problem in the 3rd century CE. The Emperor Caracalla basically said that any Roman would from now on be a Roman citizen, which simplified things, because then you could have one body of law for everyone. And that's actually the classic period of the flowering of Roman law, which eventually became the source of European law. Not British, but continental law. So, but we're talking about before all of that. I'm sure the situation was very fluid and fuzzy if you were living as a provincial, a non-citizen in the Roman world, including the Jews. So a lot could depend on the particular governor, which of course brings up the whole question of what exactly is going on in the New Testament with Pontius Pilate, right, and with the Jews, and with Agrippa, and I'm sorry, I meant Herod. Sorry, no, I meant Agrippa, right? The Agrippa who was the king at the time of the crucifixion, right? So it's that just adds to the problem that I don't really know in practice how that might have been handled, and how much leeway, if he'd wanted to, which Pontius Pilate apparently did not want to give.
Yeah.
Right.
So
it's
washing
a
the hands of the whole thing was saying, hey, not involved Sanhedrin, do you think? Is there any reason why they couldn't have multiple duties, like legislative and judicial duties?
I'm sorry, multiple?
Duties, like I mean, at the moment, our current system is that we have one legislative body, we have one judicial body, but I don't know some systems back ages ago where those were essentially the same thing.
Yeah, no, there doesn't seem to have been anything else at the time, in the sense that a group of people whose authority would be recognized. It's well, Jewish tradition from a little before this period, and there's from the early Second Temple, talks about something called the Men of the Great Assembly. And the term in Hebrew is Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, which is where the modern Israeli name Knesset comes from. That's why they decided to call it the Knesset, sort of harkening back to an earlier Jewish institution. But how that might have morphed into the Sanhedrin is not clear. I really should emphasize that there's enormous gaps in our knowledge from this period.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And
yeah, I'm quizzing you like you know absolutely everything. I'm sorry, Peter. It's just
no. But I should also emphasize that there are lots of people who know a lot more about this than I do.
Oh, yeah. No, I know. I take that as sort of given. There's always people that are specialize in different parts of history. I'm very aware of that, and I do notice you have your specialities. Well, it's been an hour and a half. It's actually been longer since we did sort of 20 minutes by ourselves kind of thing. And I really apologize, Peter. That was entirely my bad. And I take full responsibility. We've got a couple of questions coming in from Beamsy, and I will read them out because he did super chat them. His first question for $10 Australian, Beamsy says, how is comparing something that can be shown to inherently true to something that is shown to be nothing more than fables a fair comparison? So I think he's talking about, I'm not sure. I'll see if I can get the context. Ben, if you want to update me in the context. I would love to know the context. Presumably it was something that we were talking about. So feel free to update me, mate. I know I threw him in timeout, but that was a while ago. And the reason why I threw him his timeout was his second question. Is it me or does Mark look like he has a little snot coming out? Well, thanks for that, Beamsy. No, I don't. Those are the bows on my thing. They're like lines on my lip that makes the Cupid's bow of my lip. I can't remember what they're called. They're like from some thingo.
Yeah, there's a term for that. I forget.
Yeah. Philtrum. Philtrum.
Right.
Right. So it's a philtrum. Yeah. And thanks for throwing me off my entire game. I don't know. It's the Greeks used to really like the Cupid's bow. I know that. That's why it's sort of called the Cupid's bow, because they really did like it. And the Romans obviously liked it as well. So I don't know. It's some genetic thing. Look, I'm from all over the place. Australians generally are very, very varied nationalities because we have a lot of different nationalities here. I think I'm mostly English, Scottish, Irish, you name it. Yeah, I'm it. So no, it is not snot coming out. Thanks for that, Beamsy. So I think he's talking about how we sort of are comparing sort of the things that we know about the history of the world at the time with all of these sort of biblical stories and these things coming out. And I don't think it's a fair comparison. And I really dislike the idea that people say, hey, it's a book from history, so therefore it has to be accurate. I think that history sort of, we always take it as the likelihood is this, but we don't really know for sure. I think there's always uncertainty with history. And Peter, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the Bible is a historical source. It has sections that are history writing, but even history writing, I mean, when historians talk about sources, it can include all sorts of things, right? If you're a historian of World War I, you can look at movies, right? You can look at novels, but you can also look at earlier historical accounts, sort of a meta analysis, right? And in this case, there are parts of the Bible that are explicitly accounts of the kings and what happened to them and what happened in their time. And those are as much historical texts as any ancient, I would say, text like that. But to be used as a source, they also have to be analyzed. You know, what's the agenda of the writer? What assumptions do they make about their own history? How do they see, you know, what is their, if you like, philosophy of history? For example, the books of Kings tend to say that the difference between a successful and long-lived king and one who isn't, one who gets killed in a battle, say, is that the good king was one who was faithful to the covenant and to God, and the bad king wasn't. The Romans also had criteria, and occasionally they'd run into a problem like, say, the Emperor Nero, who started out as a very promising young man, and his teacher was the philosopher Seneca. You know, people still read Seneca today, so to have him, you know, sitting at your breakfast table is pretty good. But you know, later on, as an adult, he apparently did some horrific things. So then later on, people were like, "Well, what happened? You know, he was one of the good ones." You know, so everyone has their philosophy of history. So, but I was going to say, but apart from all that, of course, there's lots of stuff in the Bible which is more like the movies and the novels, right? You know, that I mentioned. It's not at all meant to be a historical account. You know, you have stories like the Book of Ruth or Job, which is you know, clearly a philosophical tale. Right? You know, you have and again, you have to think, okay, what does this tell us? For example, the Book of Ruth is an interesting example because it seems to reflect, to some degree, the reality of life around the time when the Bible in general, you know, was first began to develop. You know, people living in a town where strangers are not common, where people own their own parcel of land and they may hire other people to help them farm it and, you know, take in the harvest. It's actually also, I would say, similar to the background of a lot of the stories in the New Testament, right? You know, there's all sorts of stories in the New Testament, like, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Parables, right? Parables, you know, you have a farm, you have workers, you have a harvest, you know, you have a wedding, you know, all of these. This is the kind of background, and that's interesting when you think about it, because we're talking about, you know, well, more than 500 years, you know, between those two things, and yet I suppose that, roughly speaking, it was still, you know, the same general situation. Most people were farmers, you know. Most people did not know how to read and write. They lived in small communities. So, I don't know, did that answer the question?
Yeah, so we can take a lot from how they lived and what they did, but that story may not be sort of a factual events that happened, more just a sort of way to describe a message or a moral of the story rather than actual events that happened. But we can still glean a lot out of it, right? We can still say, absolutely, hey, that's probably how they lived, and that's, you know, things that were important to them. And
there's actually there's actually a story in the Book of Ruth, which, again, the author assumes we know what they're talking about. And what's so weird about it is that it seems to be merging two entirely different practices that we find mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, as though, and maybe in practice they were one and the same, or maybe, you know, the people who wrote those laws in the Bible felt differently about it. Really no way to know. But there's the practice. There's a practice. Where is it? Maybe I can't remember. But basically, there's something called levirate marriage, in which
Levirate marriage. Okay.
levirate, Levir. It's from the Latin word for a brother-in-law, because the idea was that if a man was married and he died without having children, that his brother, right, was supposed to take over, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And if they then did have children, then they would basically be considered legally the children of the first brother, and any property he had would go to them. Now, there's also in the Bible a description of the practice of redeeming land, meaning that a family was not supposed to permanently, it was considered a terrible thing if it permanently would lose its ancestral land, right? Which is why they had this practice of the Jubilee, in which every 50 years, right, the land was supposed to revert back. Mm-hmm. So there was a practice of redeeming land. In other words, if you had to sell it, then maybe your family, if they had enough money, could buy it back. Or if you yourself eventually got money, and it was considered, I think that the person who bought land from someone who was forced to sell it basically was obligated to take the money and give the land back. Mm-hmm. Couldn't say, well, sorry, I bought it fair and square, as Americans would say in that situation. So why do I bring this up? Because in the last chapter of the book of Ruth, what happens? It's very weird and complicated, because Ruth is a Moabite, right? But she comes to the town of Bethlehem with Naomi, right, who's from there originally, and she's sort of adopted as her daughter. And then at the end, basically, Boaz wants to marry her. Boaz is the hero of the story, but it turns out that there's another man in his family who's more closely related to Naomi, or either he's related to Naomi and Boaz isn't, or he's more closely related than Boaz. But the point is, he gets first dibs on marrying Ruth. So he has to give that up. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the story with the brother-in-law, okay, but he's not. That's the situation, right? There's no brother-in-law here. And yet, to be assuming that it's similar to the story of the brother-in-law, in which he's supposed to marry the woman, but he's allowed to refuse, in which case she basically spits at him and removes his shoe, which is a way of, I guess, humiliating him. And so he's able to get out of it, but not with that honor intact. Okay. So
I know I'm in trouble when a girl steals my shoe. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
I've got to read this again. I did not, I don't even remember that story, to be honest with you.
Yeah. So in the book of Ruth, something similar, not exactly happened. So there's this idea of redeeming, but instead of redeeming the land, it's redeeming a marriage obligation, it seems. Okay. We don't even know who this other guy is. He's not named. Right. I mean, not to say the book of Ruth isn't fictional, but his character does not have a name.
So is it just sort of passing along this marriage obligation to the rest of it would have been sort of the tribe at that point until you get to somebody who can fulfill that contract kind of thing?
I don't know about tribe, but certainly family. So basically, this guy's a relative of...
A better word for it? Clan, maybe, kind of thing, is a better word
suppose,
for it?
Yeah.
Your extended family kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
So
it's past the parcel over there. Wow.
So it's a very odd. So people who study the Bible try to figure out what is the relationship between this practice described in the book of Ruth is something normal.
Right.
It's also possible that the author was living so long after this was a thing that he got it a little,
misunderstood.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, that's a great place to call it there. One last question I'll ask is, I was in a debate the other day and somebody said to me, the Western world is built on Christian values. How does that make you feel?
How does that make me feel? Well, I guess I would ask what exactly Christian values are, and if anything, my reaction would have more to do with my familiarity with classical civilization than it would with Jewish culture, because I mean, it would be a stretch to claim.
Yeah.
Aristotle,
Archimedes,
that the Western world is built on Jewish
right.
civilization. Although, have you heard of Matthew Arnold?
I haven't, no.
He was a Victorian philosopher, I guess,
Okay.
writer. But he actually came up with that all of civilization has two sort of running through it. What he calls Hebraic and Hellenic. And he didn't literally mean, I don't think, that say French culture or German culture or whatever had been directly influenced by Jews or Greeks. He simply meant that there was a state of mind that we historically associate more with the one than the other. That the Hebrew side, which is also for him the Christian side, of course, is the side of faith and religious awe, and the feeling you get when you step into an enormous stone church when there's an organ playing in stained glass and light filtering through, that's
more that spirituality kind of wonderment and mystery.
Patiently copying books while Gregorian chants are in the background, the name of the rose, right, that kind of thing. That's the Hebraic side, whereas the Hellenic side is the side of
sorry, I thought you said Ptolemaic.
Sorry,
Hellenic, was it?
Yeah, Hellenic, the Greek side.
Hellenic,
yeah. The Hellenic side is the side of Plato and Aristotle, right? The side of nature, of celebration of the body, aesthetics. The kind of Oscar. Have you ever read Oscar Wilde at all? I love Oscar Wilde. That's the kind of thing. And he was a contemporary of. He may have written something about Matthew Arnold. I actually don't remember, but they were certainly. I'm sure they knew each other. But that's sort of a thing, right? The bright, going, leaving the cloister and going out into the bright meadow and smelling the flowers, art for art's sake. Right. That's the Hellenics. So, I mean, I think Wilde also actually had that kind of a feel about him. Actually, now I think of it. But so. In that sense, I guess you could say Western civilization does have both of those aspects, but I don't know that I would call it Christian, except in the sense that
Well, I think it comes from a lot of different influences, from a lot of different places, kind of thing. Sort of the idea of democracy, even individualism probably didn't come from either. The Greeks or the Hebrew backgrounds, but I think it's been influenced from a whole load of different things. I don't think any one group can make a claim on the origins of civilization. I think it's a sort of a cooperative effort on the part of human cultures everywhere, so that's my personal belief. But and especially with modern day being such a mixing pot of all different cultures and all different ideals. I find it hard for any one group to claim, being responsible for modern anything, really. It's just, we've had all kinds of input from all kinds of people and all walks of life. So I don't know. I'm a bit of a distributional person when it comes to the origin of things. But I want to thank you so much, Peter. I might call it here. Thank you so much for bearing with me and my unprofessionalism. It's amazing to talk to you again. We got to do this again sometime. I will give you an email sometime soon, maybe tee up something really early, but you've got to tell me what else you want to talk about, because I find out I've got 3 pages of notes every time I talk to you, but I'll rewatch it and see if I can catch up on all that you're saying. because damn it, Beamsy, you did distract me through that. But no problem at all. No problem at all. Is there anything else you'd like to add, or what you're doing, or any links to give me that I can put up for you?
You mean links to something that I'm doing?
Yeah, I mean, usually I just ask if people have got YouTube links or anything like. Have you started a channel since I've last seen you that I don't know about? And
no.
Okay,
the truth is, I don't know about you, but the last few years it's become harder to feel that if you don't have an online presence, it's hard to feel that you actually exist as a live human being, So I'm exaggerating.
That's a very interesting sort of perspective. I mean, I was basically forced into doing this. I'll be quite honest with you. Peter DeTucker basically bugged me until I agreed to do it. But I mean, Maya's saying it's sort of she really loved this discussion. A lot of people said they really liked the previous discussion, so it's been really good every time I've talked to you. And quite frankly, Peter, I'm an introvert, mate. I'm not really love to get out and mingle with people, which is odd where I've ended up. So I kind of I don't know. I don't believe that you have to have an online presence. I generally don't do social media. I generally am an introvert, but yeah. So I don't think that at all. It just depends on how much you want to put yourself out there, really. Yeah. That's about it, really. I mean, I'm quite happy hiding away at home, but I do like the debate. I will give you that. I really do like engaging with people. So yeah, and I want to give a big thanks to all of my members who are just amazing. Hang on, I've got a banner here somewhere, that professionalism I was talking about. So thank you everybody so much. And yeah, do give a big thanks to Peter, who came in and educated us on retconning for Jesus, I believe was the term I used.
That's a good term. I like it.
Yeah. No, it just occurred to me while I was listening. I'm like, that's like somebody going back and you've got an old series and they're going, oh, but wait, if we put our guy in here, we can, we can make it so that other character was his mother. And it's just like, wow, they're retconning for Jesus. Feel free to use it. I don't know. Thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciate it. And don't forget to be kind to each other. Be kind to yourself, most of all. And I will catch you in the next one. Thank you.